it is impossible to achieve exposure without suffering.
It is impossible to achieve the aim without suffering.
I'm talking today to Robert Fripp, a legend of sorts in the music business, who entertained us through the cheerful insanity of Giles, Giles and Fripp, the progenitive progressive rock band King Crimson, and more recently as producer and contributor to some of the better albums of the past year or two. He is currently involved in the first phase of the drive to 1981. He has joined me here today on the terrace overlooking the beautiful Don Valley. Robert, would it be accurate to say that this project started as a result of the hiatus you took after 1974 to study the works of Bennett and Gurdjieff?
Well, around the middle of 1978, finding that I was much against my expectations, and quite to my surprise, I found that I was in fact working very, very hard indeed. That I'd been involved in quite a few projects up till then. The Heroes album, producing Daryl Hall's Sacred Songs first solo album, producing Peter Gable's second solo album, and being well stuck into Exposure. So, deciding to adopt this adage, go the whole hog including the postage, decided to commit myself to an energetic 3-year campaign that, giving my activities some sense of form and direction, would enable me to maximize everything that I was doing in a number of different ways. Hence the drive to 1981. This 3-year campaign beginning in September 1978, which was the original release date for the Exposure album. This is when Daryl Hall was on 17 minutes of it, before RCA before RCA objected, and culminates on September the 11th, 1981.
Is that the day of the apocalypse?
No, it's the day that the drive to 1981 completes. Symbolically, for astrologers, it's a day the planets line up in the solar system. So that seemed to be a good symbolic date. I'm not myself an authority on astrology, but it seemed a good symbolic date. That is, of course, the day that the first 3-year campaign ends and the second 3-year campaign begins. This is the decline to 1984.
And what will that bring? Or have you worked that out, what that's going to be, or do you just take that in terms of what's happened after 1981, or up until 1981?
I never force an outcome that or if one could say one has an idea of a beginning and an end, one can never accurately predict what the end might be, or else this becomes a dead concern, a mechanistic matter. So, in that the drive to 1981 is taking on a character of its own, which the more rational parts of me discover once it's in course. It would seem to, the motto is human contact, and one of the main senses would seem to be establishment. This would seem to be one of the key tenets of the drive to 1981, that small mobile units have a period of some 2.5 years to get in place, however they wish to interpret it for themselves. One example of that would be that I'm looking for premises to have a guitar school in Wimborne, Dorset, my home, and with land prices in Wimborne increasing at 50% a year and property prices by 25% a year, I don't have very much longer in order to find them. So the drive to 1981 would be a question of establishing the premises, and the key word of the decline to 1984 might be consolidation, to pull together that into a viable concern which is largely able to take care of its own affairs. Self-sufficient would be another fairly trendy kind of word to use for that. But in terms of the details, no, if I pinned down the exact details of the situation, it would mean that I allowed no room for growth within the campaign. The campaign is not perhaps a living thing from one point of view, but it can take on a character of its own. There is an interchange between myself and the campaign.
And the audience.
In terms of playing to people, yes, very much so. Human contact, human interaction. Vitally important for the 1980s and 1990s. Unless we find a way to recover this sense of being able to deal with other people in a respectful way, the future is going to be very difficult indeed. For example, we look at a hive of bees, and so rarely are we struck how well each of these individual small units work well together. If we could, as people, have some sense of that community, the world's problems would disappear far quicker than we could at the moment conceive. But it's not enough to wish to do that. One needs techniques, one needs tools to enable oneself to do it. Hoping for it is simply not enough. There has to be a considerable wish, and then techniques.
Then is the drive to 1981 simply your way of achieving this?
This is obviously my way of dealing with these kind of ideas. And different people will give them different names and approach them from different backgrounds, because everyone is different. But yes, if any idea has any validity, it must be tested against the idea's capacity for working change. In other words, if one is attracted to some bright cosmological notion, unless we can find a way of making it work in a very ordinary, down-to-earth way as part of our mundane chore of earning a living, it simply doesn't work. So any seemingly profound or complex notion, if it is, if you like, true, whatever that might mean, it can be reduced to very simple principles, which can be understood by us all in some way as part of our day-to-day practical life. So, yes, the drive to 1981 is obviously my way of working with these ideas, that for me the challenge is to see if I can incorporate them in terms of what I'm doing, and for other people to see whether there is any, if you like, sympathetic note struck within them for it.
How did you evolve this philosophy? Was it largely, was this just a natural progression, or does it stem largely from your studies?
Well, both, and all these and a few more and less besides. That going to Sherborne House was, of course, a critical experience for me, and I'm indebted quite considerably to J.G. Bennett, the man who founded this school, whose life was a very difficult one. But for me, seeing Bennett, who was, if you like, I think not originally a very pleasant or easy man, the difference in his life through his remarkable commitment to working with these ideas, I think was an inspiration. And anyone can talk, words are cheap. But he integrated the ideas in his own life in a way which was undeniable. To see, for example, in his autobiography Witness, which was originally written, I think, at the end of the 50s, early 60s, I have this sense of a man who was quite full of himself. A very clever man. But a man who was still very full of himself. And the last two chapters, which were written in 1972 at Sherborne House, convey a sense of a man who has changed quite remarkably. So yes, obviously the whole Sherborne House thing was a remarkable experience for me. It hasn't gone away. It means more to me now than it did when I was there.
Well, how did you leave it? I would think, especially
Gratefully.
following on Bennett's example of the deep commitment that it would take to be a follower of yourself, as it ends up. How would you break away from that?
Well, what normally happens, there's three things happen. The first is that one accepts the ideas and it keeps them as they are. The difficulty here is, of course, that they can become dogma. The advantage is that it keeps the original form in unpolluted and undiluted fashion. The second thing is that a person accepts the ideas but works with them in their own particular way, which is actually what Bennett did. And the third thing is people says, thank God that's over. I really didn't like that.
But
and
it's not
off.
over.
Not for me.
Not for
much
you.
as I would wish it might be, it's not.
How do you continue it then if it's not over?
By work. By work.
Your work is your way of continuation of the...
In a sense, yes.
Things that
The
Dennis
drive to
started
1981 is my way of working with these ideas. On one level, it's my personal discipline. And it's not always easy to turn up at a performance or a record shop when one is tired and irritable and really not wishing to be there simply because, well, one wouldn't mind a night off. We all recognise this. Even turning up at a nice radio station, there are certainly days when one simply doesn't want to go on the air. And one has to find a way of doing it. And if one can make that effort, then suddenly all the difficulties seem to fall away and something else can happen. That's a remarkable moment. So there's always part of us that doesn't want to, and there's always part of us which really does wish to. And we have to find how we can somehow reconcile the two. Yes, there are only 2 days, I think, 2 situations where I've really failed. And one was in New York, and the other was yesterday, when I was just so exhausted I found it very difficult to be even civil.
And how did you react to the situation? Did you just turn it off and go away?
I was very tempted to go out and do some raving last night, but instead I was very quiet with myself.
Which is more discipline.
It required a discipline, yes.
Okay, in the notes to Exposure, you thank Eno for the technology of the Skysaw guitar
Yes.
and tape system, which permitted Frippertronics.
Yes.
What exactly is the Skysaw guitar?
Right, Skysaw refers to a kind of sound, and the name is taken from Eno's piece, Skysaw on
It is
Another
Skysaw,
Green
okay.
World. Yes. The sound is obtained by putting a guitar into a DDL line, digital delay line, bringing it out and putting it in a second time. And for anyone who tries this, the overtone's thrown off by this vary quite considerably, and therefore the sound itself changes quite considerably, depending on the length of millisecond delay. An 8 millisecond delay gives an entirely different kind of sound to a 12 millisecond delay, for example. That's SkySaw. The tape technique, which enabled the development of Frippatronics, is the technique used by Eno and myself on No Pussyfooting and Evening Star.
Oh, so it didn't refer to the same time as SkySaw, which was, he probably taught you that in 1975?
No, Eno developed that one a bit later. Yes. Well, I first worked with this tape technique for Frippatronics 7 years ago this month, which was when the side one of No Pussyfooting was recorded. The very first time I ever visited Eno on a social, in a social way, went round to his house and he said, plug in. And for reasons I still am not aware of, I took my guitar and pedal board and plugged in. He didn't tell me what would happen. I did it. And side one of No Pussyfooting is the very first time we'd ever worked together in any way at all.
And that's with the Revoxes?
That was with the 2 Revoxes, yes.
And that is the tape system, so...
That's what I'll be doing tonight.
Right, and tomorrow night.
And tomorrow night. And quite a few nights after that.
Well, if you started that, and you're obviously very interested in that tape system, because you're still using it, it's strange to me that you didn't follow through with, well, as you did the 2 albums with Eno, why you didn't continue with the Obscure series that he put out, the Discrete Music Project.
Oh, but I am. As he is, except
subtly,
it's called ambient now. And Frippatronics, a lot of Frippatronics is ambient, and Music for Sports, to be released in January, which is volume 1 of Frippatronics, probably a double album. Much of it will be ambient music, following Eno's definition of that music which is as ignorable as it is listenable, to provide an intelligent and qualitative alternative to Muzak. Oh yes, I'm in fact, at the time ambient was coming together, unbeknownst to Eno, I went along and did all I could to encourage the establishment of this label, and promised, in order to support it, that I would myself provide albums within that category. Eno and I would very much like to get together a catalogue of a lot of music to be taken on by an in-house music firm.
Would this be in the line of the guitar meditations that you were thinking
yes,
of releasing? Yes,
Frippatronics and guitar meditations are the same things.
Oh,
yes.
Oh, okay.
Obscure as a label has actually been closed as from last week, the week before last. Yeah.
So they're just the 10 records?
Yes.
Okay. Now that we're on that, on the topic of that music, and you say that it can be background music, we get to a question. It's the difference between art and just sound. When does turning on a tape recorder, starting up a tape loop, and just letting it go endlessly, when does it become art, as opposed to just a mechanical drone that goes on? What's the qualitative difference?
It's the difference between art and craft. Craft are the techniques one adopts in order to get to art.
And you have to understand the techniques before you can get to art?
No, if you don't have any techniques, you can find it immediately.
Techniques stand in the way of art, of pure inspiration.
One can approach it either with innocence or with mastery. Mastery is the capacity to reacquaint oneself with innocence. I had breakfast in New York about 6 months ago with a Sufi musician who was touring with the Konya Whirling Dervishes, and he said to me that the best music he had ever heard had been played by peasants in the fields of Turkey tending sheep. They were innocent. They knew nothing of music, only how to make contact with it. Now, to use an analogy with making love, if one is an innocent, there is an appeal in the situation. if one has, if you like, skillfully mastered the arts of love, there is also an appeal in the situation. If one no longer has innocence or technique, one is only a feeble lay. So, if one has lost one's innocence, one must proceed to the situation in which one has mastery. This is difficult. This takes time. This takes a lot of effort. In terms of the new wave bands, who, for 1 or 2 evenings a month that they would play, can find it's possible to get through the gig on enthusiasm alone. But if one is playing 28 days out of 31, one has to be a professional. Now, a professional, to continue the analogy, would be a hooker. So one has to have those techniques, but it's not enough. One has to have mastery. One then has to go through the process of having lost one's innocence, finding ways of getting in touch with that part of oneself which has the innocence. Another analogy would be to construct a building from which one can leap. Or my English master, Arthur Maiden, Fishy Maiden, used to say to me, "Fripp, the art is to conceal the art." Reading yet another of my interminable essays, I would say the art is to abandon the art. If there's so many different ways. You know Blake, he who catches joy as it flies learns to live in eternity's sunrise. This is the determining characteristic of art or any kind of real experience, that it's that intangible quality, that magic, that which can't be captured. You're playing my record. That which can't be pinned down because it simply belongs in another world. But we can recognize it when it comes, but we can't capture it. If, to continue this series of alternative metaphors, mixing them well, if that quality is the wind which bloweth where it listeth, we can't govern the wind, but we can raise a sail. So the responsibility of the craftsman is to construct the sail so that when the wind is blowing, it can take him along with it. So the artist is the man who understands this. The craftsman is the man who is still building the sail.
How do you determine which is which? How can you spot the phony?
By developing a part of oneself which is in tune with that intangible, which can recognize it. And all of us have this capacity, except we're often out of touch with it. But even if we're out of touch of it, this capacity can be developed. It only requires work. For example, when I began playing guitar, I was tone deaf and had no sense of rhythm. Therefore, for me, I should be hope to anyone who was interested in becoming a musician. You don't even need ears to be a musician. But what you do require is an awful lot of hard work. And anyone who is not prepared to make that particular effort should not proceed. I remember reading Fundamentals of Philosophy, in which it said that the aim of philosophy is not to find answers, but to find better questions. For example, on exposure, there are a number of paradoxes and contradictions proposed. And people say, is it a hoax? Well, is it a hoax? And this is just what happened in this record shop in town. Records on Wheels. Someone came up and said, is it all a hoax? And I explained that if one saw the album Exposure on the 3 levels in which it was constructed, it wouldn't be that one would have an answer to the question. It would simply be that the question would go away. That it would be like trying to tie a knot in 4 dimensions. It's only a problem in 3 dimensions. That's the only situation in which a knot can be tied. So in 4 dimensions, the problem is simply not there. I don't have any problems at all in working in different areas with different musicians and so on. Because nothing, if you like, predicates my behaviour in that situation. If I went along thinking, this is not an avant-garde event, or this is an avant-garde event, it would very much limit my behaviour. For example, if one raises the sail, one doesn't govern the wind takes one where it does. And after the event, one can perhaps say, now that's what was happening. But at the time, one simply goes with it.
Well, you have been associated with the avant-garde, rightly or wrongly, and...
Well, it depends on your perspective.
Well, what do you consider yourself? Do you consider
simply
yourself at times?
I consider myself to be a human being who plays a guitar, and from time to time is a musician. The guitar is the sail I raise, and the musician is when the wind takes me. And that's what I do. All I have to do is present what I'm doing. That's all that I have to do. I can't govern people's reactions to it. If what I present has a quality, I do believe that we all have this capacity to respond to it. I've noticed that there are various reactions to Frippatronics. I think it's, perhaps coincidentally and perversely, one of the most remarkably commercial things I've ever done, since from another point it's obviously the least commercial thing I've ever done. But as soon as one is trying to restrict oneself in terms of patterns of what understands to be commercial behaviour, you're limiting your situation. That means that you're limiting your possibility for quality to enter the situation, which means that people, if we accept this possibility that we all have of recognising quality in some way, that we prevent this possibility from taking place. So I go out and do what I do, as best as I can do, and I sense that's all we have to. I can go into 3 definitions of what is commercial, but what the industry would normally consider to be commercial, in my opinion, is not. And since 80% of so-called commercial records made in America fail, being commercial means you have a 4 to 1 chance of failing.
But you had considerable difficulty with record companies.
Yes, I do. But the conventional wisdom of the industry is always 2 to 5 years behind the event.
Do you think they'll catch up?
No. It's not in the nature of what they are. There are possibilities. There are possibilities for change, but it would require, first of all, changing the scale of organisation. That a dinosaur record company has no hope.
In a way that it is that way.
the record industry is at the moment going through a very, very difficult time, simply because its very worst excesses are no longer possible in the current situation. They never were necessary. So to my mind, the record industry at the moment has no more real problems than it used to. It's just recognising a more appropriate situation. Now, it requires intelligence to act on what one sees to be appropriate. So one can act either from intelligence or from necessity. I sense we have a period of some 2.5 to 5 years to act intelligently, to change our scale of organisation from the large and the dinosauric to a small, mobile and intelligent size. Because after that period we shall have to do it through necessity. But because we shall at that time have no time to adjust, we must be intelligent now, yes. That there are possibilities open to us now which simply won't be there in 5 years' time, if we act now.
In 3 to 5 years, is that the apocalypse?
It depends how
when it is.
Well, it depends how what one terms by the apocalypse and so on.
What is it for you?
Seeing the situation as it is. That's what the apocalypse is. Seeing the situation as it is. And it's wholly terrifying. For me it lasted for about half a second. And I simply saw that Robert Fripp didn't exist. That there was nothing there. And from that position one can begin.
What was your next step? Once you realized that?
Shook with fear and got on with pushing the barrow load of compost, which I was then pushing. Well, obviously it takes time to absorb that kind of insight.
When did it take place?
After I'd been at Sherborne House for about 2 months. I was down by the woodwork shop. This is part of the idea of exposure. That one is exposed. One simply... This light is suddenly thrown on the situation and one sees oneself exposed as being like the Emperor, completely naked. And it's a very terrifying moment. It is impossible to achieve exposure without suffering. The aim, in order to work towards this aim, one must know from which position one begins. So one has to see that there just isn't anything there. And this involves suffering. Very difficult. These are very difficult ideas. And so much suffering is unnecessary. But we can find the energy for the right kind of suffering if we give up the kind of suffering which simply isn't necessary. For example, if one's greedy, one suffers in an awful way. But if one simply gives up being greedy, the problem isn't there anymore.
Okay, you came upon these understandings while studying Gurdjieff and
well,
Ouspensky
Bennett
and
was
people like
Bennett
that?
was my teacher. Bennett, who was a pupil of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, but mainly Gurdjieff. And I'm not at all interested in pushing, in an evangelical sense, any particular school of thought or whatever.
Well, that's my question, basically. Does it matter which school of thought that you go through?
No, I don't believe it does. That, as Rajneesh would say, they're all fingers pointing to the moon. And the nearer one gets to the moon, so more and more they say the same thing. I remember going to Tai Chi classes in London, England, with a very remarkable woman. And I said to her that I didn't know whether to keep going with the Gurdjieff movements or with Tai Chi. And someone suggested to me that they were really both the same. And she said, yes, they are both the same, but only after a point. And that's dead right. So for me, I am just as happy working with a sincere agnostic as I am anyone else. However one wishes to approach this idea of so-called New Age or New World ideas. Doesn't matter, provided one has the commitment, That's the only requirement, a commitment. And the particular forms it happens to take, for me, it doesn't really matter. That I might share a similar technical vocabulary with people at Sherborne, that if one talked about sensitive and automatic energies, they would know in a flash what I meant, simply because we have a common terminology. But it doesn't mean that I or them are any better than anyone else. It simply means we have a common language.
Which means that you could relate just as well to, say, a Buddhist, but you might
well,
have to talk in different languages.
I would say only after a certain point. After a certain point we could understand each other.
Once you get the vocabulary over with, some common understanding.
I found with this Sufi musician that I had breakfast with, who had known Bennett, and a lot of Gurdjieff's background was Sufic, actually from the Naqshbandi dervishes. That our approach to music was very similar. Very similar, even though for me it was a question of working almost entirely on instinct, whereas for him, he had learnt a certain approach. But nevertheless, although the backgrounds were completely dissimilar, the approach was fundamentally the same.
Well, there's another aspect of the identity that I wanted to ask you. In an interview last year, you talked about the problems involved in producing an album for someone else, which is something you have been doing a lot of. And the question is, do you exploit the act or the art of what they're doing, or try and help the artist find his or her own musical identity, which may be less commercially viable? But how do you find producing yourself within those confines?
Very rewarding is the answer to the last question. But there's lots of questions there, you see. What is audio verite? The commitment to try and capture on record whatever the essence of the artist might be. Now, coming back to the idea I was saying earlier, that I believe that if one commits oneself to any particular venture, to put as much quality into it as possible, I sense that is the most commercial thing one can do, not to censor one's behaviour. So if one does commit oneself to making, if you like, an essential album, I think that's all one can do in terms of trying to sell it as well. I don't see this as being exclusive. The normal idea of here's the artist, he is or they are an excuse to let the record take place. Well, it's very true from one point of view, but not from the commercial point of view, where the producer or the record company have some notion of what might be a commercial product, and then the artist has to suffer that particular straitjacket or whatever in order to create some prefabricated notion of what is immediately viable in a commercial sense. This is where the performer accepts a certain role, just as the listener accepts a certain role. Now, normally the idea we have of a performer is that they do something, and when something remarkable comes out, they are therefore a demigod, they are therefore wonderful. It's not like that at all. One accepts a role as a performer, one accepts a role as a listener. Presenting oneself in that situation, music might happen, something remarkable might happen. But it attributes no special worth to the performer or the listener. They've simply put themselves in this situation where something might happen. They've created conditions in which music can take place. Now, in terms of the artist taking on a certain aspect which they can then incorporate into their character, if one puts oneself in a situation in which music can take place, and music does take place, and more one works on this proposition of raising the sail, constructing the sail so the breeze can take us. The breeze can take us to some quite remarkable places which might therefore change us as human beings. that we might find that the process of these journeys do give us certain insights. And in that sense we can change. This idea about the so-called Frippatronics being in the avant-garde and what is its kind of reaction. I get far more propositions now from Frippatronics in the past 3 months than I ever did in 6 years of rock and roll with King Crimson. So I sense something must be on target. And may I say that women tend to understand it in a far more direct way than men do. Men try and understand it in terms of good ideas, process of construction of music and so on. Women don't seem to prat about with that. They get the message in a far more direct fashion. Good.
And they don't need the labels then?
I think not. Wonderful place.
Well, you're welcome to come back anytime.
Is there somewhere for me to stay?
We'll find you a place to stay.